Okay, today we're going to go over the Civil Rights Movement, or at least a decent part of it. Civil Rights Movement is one of these other gigantic events in U.S. history that spans several decades, and there's been much that historians have written about it. So there's many books and articles on history of different movements and different groups and different leaders. Unfortunately, in a lot of kind of general U.S. history textbooks, a whole lot of the civil rights movement kind of just gets broken down and follows Martin Luther King and his group. But you have to remember, this is almost like the progressive movement. There's many different groups in the civil rights movement in many different locations throughout the United States, and in some cases internationally. We just don't have enough time to cover every single one of those groups and what their specific demands were and what their specific actions were and who their leaders were and whatnot. So we'll try to stick to the kind of general highlights of it. There is still a lot of debate about when exactly the civil rights movement gets going. Some historians argue that it stretches way back into the early 1900s. There were different movements of different groups for full civil rights amongst all minorities, even going back to the 1800s. So this is nothing new, but what differentiates this civil rights movement that we're going to start with in the mid-1950s is that it is far more successful in changing laws and getting more real on-the-ground freedoms for individuals than any other movement, any other era of U.S. history that we've talked about so far. So a lot of historians locate this kind of new version of the civil rights movement starting about 1954, when you get a big court case that attacks segregated education policy. And this case is called Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Basically, there was a family, their last name is Brown, and they sued their local school board in the city of Topeka in Kansas. They basically sued the school district because the school district was segregated. There were schools for white kids and then schools for minority kids. And this is a minority family that sued and got help from lawyers that wanted to support their cause. I can't remember, I'd have to look up exactly when the original lawsuit was filed, but usually it takes several years for an original lawsuit to work its way up through the court system and get to the Supreme Court. So this 1954 that you see on this slide here is the year that the Supreme Court rendered its final decision, the very last appeal. So the final decision is basically overturning an older Supreme Court decision from the late 1800s, from 1896, a decision called Plessy v. Ferguson. And in that case, in 1896, the Supreme Court decided in another lawsuit that segregation is legal and it can happen as long as the two groups are treated with a, quote, separate but equal status. So you can separate two different parts of society and, keep them in different hotels and restaurants and schools and all these different kinds of things, as long as they're treated equally, they have equal access to resources. So if you want to separate the races or however else you divide people up, you have to give an equal amount of funding and opportunity to both sides, even though that they're separated from each other. In 1954, with this school district lawsuit, the Supreme Court overturned that idea of separate but equal and argued that whenever you separate people and you keep them in different areas, different schools, whatever, that is inherently unequal. You're only doing that because you want to give favoritism to one group. You basically want to give them more funding or more resources and keep other people outside of that. So that's the reasoning that the Supreme Court gave to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. And the decision basically says that the school district in Topeka has to integrate. Its schools can no longer separate the races. They have to bring them all together in the same classrooms. And with that as the example, the Supreme Court says that not only this school district has to integrate, but all school districts and all government-funded, all taxpayer-funded institutions have to be open to all people. So this is it starts off as a kind of small decision impacting this one school district, but they kind of scale it up. The Supreme Court makes it a kind of national decision, saying that it is illegal for publicly funded institutions to have segregation. And it's a unanimous Supreme Court decision. Every single judge on the Supreme Court agreed with this decision, which was seen as an attempt by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to get so much unity on the court that no one in the country would dare question the court's authority. Because usually in Supreme Court decisions you have a split decision, some judges disagree. But the Chief Justice with this decision realized it was so important and would probably be so difficult to implement, convince people of, as you can see in the picture here on the slide, that before releasing the decision, he negotiated with the other 8 judges and made sure that everyone would sign on to it to give a unanimous, unquestioned stand for integration. And the decision basically says that the United States is built on the idea of equal opportunity. And if you separate people, even in schools, I mean, the idea of public school is the idea of open, equal opportunity for all people. And you can see that just by looking around almost any classroom in the country now. But the Supreme Court said in 1954 that if you have a segregated school system, that just stabs the idea of equal opportunity right in the heart. Because schooling, education is how people often bring themselves out of poverty. Let's see. The biggest problem with the decision in '54 is that the Supreme Court, we know with hindsight now, the Supreme Court did not demand that all school districts integrate immediately next week and they have it done by Friday. They wrote in the decision that would basically be too difficult for every single school district to completely upend their systems. So the Supreme Court did not set any deadline, any hard deadline for school districts to integrate. The Supreme Court said instead that they should pursue desegregation, integration of the races in the schools, with, quote, all deliberate speed, instead of immediately. And what we now know is that this picture is an example of a bunch of racist white people who don't want their kids going to school with minority students. All the most heavily racist states, basically the states from the old Confederacy that have fought the Civil War to defend slavery, these so-called Deep South states basically do as little as they possibly can to integrate their schools because the leaders of those states, the governors, the mayors of the cities, the sheriffs of the police departments, and the leaders on the school boards, they're basically all racist. And they say that if you bring the races together and in the classrooms, kids from different races will start dating each other, you'll get racial intermarriage, and they say that will destroy the white race, basically. They called it mongrelizing the white race, basically comparing all minority people to basically animals, mongrels. So, and I also like this picture because you can see the signs that the racists are holding up outside the Supreme Court. This is their protest right outside the court building. Their signs also give you another inkling of what's going on in the 1950s, which we've already talked about before with the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and the anti-communism movements. If you read the sign closely, it says race mixing is communism. And, they say that theoretically if you make all people equal, and that's what communists want to do, they get rid of all definitions of rich and poor and just make everyone into big lump sum kind of a group where there's no big distinctions like that. The Soviet Union had done a lot of that kind of stuff, but you can see that they're using this anti-communism to really attack any enemy that they have. And they'll eventually accuse the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of being a communist, which is really ridiculous. but anyone that's pursuing policies, any politician that they don't like, they just try to destroy their reputation by just labeling them a communist. And any policy they don't like, they'll just say that that's what communists like, so the United States can't do that stuff. So anti-communism is often like a knee-jerk reaction whenever they hear of a policy or a person they don't like. They just try to destroy it, just try to stop considering it just by calling it communism. All right. So the Supreme Court gives this demand to all these school districts all over the country that they have to integrate their students of different races. The biggest crisis, the most public one, hits at a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas called Central High School, where the governor literally brought out the National Guard, the state militia of Arkansas, and surrounded the administration building with the state soldiers to try to prevent black students from registering for classes and from attending the first days of school. So this is a state government using its own state military power to try to stop racial integration. And the governor, shot up in popularity because a lot of white racists, which are basically the only people voting in Arkansas at this point because they're violently repressing the black vote, the governor's approval ratings went through the roof because all white people in the state loved what, or not all of them, but a whole lot of them, loved what this governor was doing, trying to stop their white students from having to take classes with black students. And this causes a crisis because now you have a demand from the federal government that integration is the law of the land, and this high school is breaking the law, and the governor is breaking the law. So now it goes right up to the President of the United States. What are you going to do? Are you going to enforce the law, or are you going to allow this governor to get away with it? Because if you allow this one governor then to get away with this, the other governors are going to keep doing it over and over again, and it'll stop the integration process. And President Eisenhower at this point, this is 54, 55, Eisenhower's in office, and he wasn't elected on really any kind of domestic platform at all. He's elected on a Cold War, we're going to defeat the Soviets and save the world kind of platform. So he has a big decision to make. And he's from Kansas. So he's from like one of these border states that has a lot of heavy racism and is a state where, there's a ton of segregation. And remember, the original lawsuit came from Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. So the President of the United States has a big, big decision to make, and everyone in the world is watching him at this point to see what he's going to decide. And even though he didn't think segregation was such a bad thing, he decides to side with the Supreme Court and sends in the U.S. Army, the 101st Airborne Division, which was a famous division from World War II, paratroopers basically, to go to the Little Rock High School and take control of the state National Guard, the state militia, and protect the students and help them register for classes. So Eisenhower sends a message to newspapers and Congress and whatnot, saying that he has nationalized the Arkansas State Guard, which basically means that the President of the United States issued an order to the Arkansas State Guard, making them an official part of the U.S. Army now, for a while. And if they're an official part of the U.S. Army, he, the President, is the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military, so now they follow orders directly from him, from the President in the White House, rather than from their state governor. And he orders the Guard to stand down and allow the U.S. Army to go in and escort and protect these students in their attempt to register for classes. And he said publicly that he didn't really agree with what the Supreme Court had done, but he realized that the job of the President of the United States is to enforce the law. And the president doesn't get to choose which laws they're supposed to enforce, just like a police chief isn't supposed to choose which laws they're supposed to enforce. They have to enforce everything. Because if you start picking and choosing, then you get into the problem of favoritism. You start enforcing the laws you like and ignoring the laws you don't like. So President Eisenhower said publicly, I don't really agree with this, but it's the law of the land for the Supreme Court, and it has to be enforced. Eisenhower also argued more privately that sending the Army in to enforce federal law it's in a way protecting federal power, federal government authority over the authority of individual states. So he also says he's doing this to overcome the old states' rights argument, which the Constitution says the federal government is supreme. The Supreme Court has made that decision several times, so it's a normal part of U.S. law code, basically. So that's the signal that the White House sends to the rest of the country. You're going to have to integrate, and you're not going to be able to be allowed to stop integration. And here's another image of a lot of local white guys coming out to protest that their kids are going to be allowed to register for classes with black students and actually have to interact with black students on some level, at least walking down the hall or sitting in the same classroom or something like that. They came out to the school sites to protest and very often threaten the black students. Say, if you register for classes, I'm going to come kill you in the middle of the night. So part of the U.S. Army's job was to push those local white racists away from the schools to protect the students. And this is what you see an image of. The U.S. Army with bayonets on their guns, pointing their guns at their own citizens, telling them to go home. And so this is all front page news. This is very dramatic stuff, and the whole world is watching this. So Eisenhower, that's the message in the Eisenhower White House, and very, 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 very slowly, schools start to integrate. And when President Kennedy comes into office, Eisenhower wins the election of 52 and 56, and the Constitution's been altered by this point, so a president can only serve 2 terms in office. So in 1960, it's kind of an open race, and John F. Kennedy wins the presidential election of 60, goes into office in 61, and is immediately challenged by Southern governors that are basically doing the same thing, bringing out their sometimes National Guard, sometimes, like in this image, personally, the governor goes to this is in Alabama, I think, or Mississippi. The governor of the state goes and literally stands in the doorway. That's what you see on the kind of top left picture here. The governor standing in the doorway of the University of Mississippi to personally try to make sure that black students do not register. And this is an outright challenge to the new president, Kennedy. Are you going to do what Eisenhower did? Are you going to send in the army? Or is Kennedy going to back down? And Kennedy's response is to basically do the same thing that Eisenhower did, demand that the individual states fulfill their obligations, their legal obligations to have integrated classes and integrated schools, and by this point, universities. So Kennedy keeps pushing it. Kennedy is, since his election in 1960 was so close, it was one of the closest in all of American history up until recent times, since the year 2000. But Kennedy did not really want to get involved in these debates because it was so polarizing. It upset so many people. So Kennedy, for his presidency, until he's murdered, he really does almost as much as he possibly can for the first 2.5 years that he's in office to really avoid this civil rights debate as much as he can. He tries to stay out of it. And it's really only in I think it's in June '63, which is just 4 or 5 months before he's murdered, does he finally take a stand on civil rights in a televised speech to the country. He says that the civil rights movement is a giant challenge to the American nation if it's going to really fulfill its promises of equal opportunity and real political and social equality, legal equality for all citizens. So that's one kind of problem of the early 60s. The civil rights movement is growing and growing. They keep trying to push the Kennedy administration to take a stance and do something about it. But school integration does not really become a big fact until really the late 1960s and early 70s, for several reasons. Number one, this idea of all deliberate speed that the Supreme Court originally said, states, especially the southern states, did everything they possibly could to really drag their feet in implementing integration, just delay it as much as they possibly can. And so by the late 1960s, the Supreme Court gets really impatient and says, really, you've had over 10 years now, you've had plenty of time to plan it, it's time for you to do it. And you also get a president of the United States, the vice president when Kennedy is shot, named Johnson, when Kennedy dies, becomes president. And Johnson is much more open and forceful in pushing for civil rights. So the federal government in the mid to late 60s starts demanding, the White House starts demanding that local schools and other public parks and whatnot integrate their spaces, their places. And a lot of these schools, and especially universities, rely on federal government funding, taxpayer money from the federal government. And what the threat that really seems to do it, to really push integration forward, by the late 60s, the federal government will start threatening local schools, saying that if you don't integrate, you're not going to get the money. And your school will basically run out of money and won't have good books, and won't have enough money to kind of refurbish their classrooms and all kinds of things. So it's the money threat. When the federal government threatens to withhold that money, that's what seems to really push a lot of these school districts forward in pursuing integration. So you can see at the bottom of this slide, even by 1968, only 6% of black children are enrolled in school. And then you start getting the money threat very heavily, and within 5 years that skyrockets to 90%. So that's a big, 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 big change. All right. So next section is really just beyond school districts, which is what we've kind of focused on so far for the first few years. Going back to 1955, you start seeing an increasingly public confrontation between racist segregation systems, and especially black citizens who try to do things in public and get public awareness going, get public attention for their movements to try to bring down these segregated systems in one way or the other. And one of the most famous of these happens in Montgomery, Alabama in late 1955, and this has to do with the bus system. The bus system was segregated going into 1955. The basic rule on the bus is that black passengers had to sit in the back and white passengers would sit in the front, so they wouldn't have to kind of interact with each other. So even though they're on the same bus, they wouldn't have to talk to each other or sit next to each other or anything like that. So it's kind of segregation on the city bus system, which is a privately owned bus company. And if the bus is full and a white person gets on and there's nowhere to sit, a white person could demand that a black person give up their seat. So that was the bus company's rule. And in December 1955, one of the buses is full, and one of the black people sitting on the seat is named Rosa Parks. And a white passenger gets on the bus and wants to sit down, and so, very insulting kind of way, demands that this young black woman give up her seat so that this white guy can sit down. And she refused. She refused to get up, and the passenger got all angry and told the bus driver, and the bus driver stopped the bus and went back there and told her that she had to get up because this is the bus's rule, and that if she rides on the bus, she has to accept the rules. And she still refused to give up her seat, so the bus driver called a local policeman who happened to be in the area, and policeman came by and arrested her for breaking the rule. And so on the right side, you see her mugshot just for refusing to give up her seat. She's arrested, and she's booked, and she's jailed for a couple days. And Rosa Parks planned this action, and we know this now. Rosa Parks was a longtime civil rights activist in Montgomery. And she is a member of a civil rights group in Montgomery that was trying to get city and statewide attention for their movement and their complaints against segregation. And she's a young, hard-working. She was on her way home from work that day as she was arrested. And so her group was ready for this. And right when her mugshot is taken, they have their own newspaper and their own printing shops and whatnot. So they print many copies of her mugshot and a news story, basically, and circulate it throughout the black community and try to get as much public attention on this as they possibly can to embarrass the bus company to the point where they changed their rule. But the bus company didn't give in. And that's one thing about a lot of racists, even today. They believe that they're absolutely right. And they don't listen to debate. They don't listen to any outside possibilities that they might be wrong. They believe that, you absolutely have to keep the races separate, and there's some kind of scientific amalgamation of different races would cause some kind of weird interbreeding or some crap like that. Racism generally pretty stupid. But they don't listen to kind of logical arguments or even reasonable just social arguments. They don't listen to evidence for a lot of their beliefs, except for the evidence that they want to believe. So the bus company doesn't give in to these demands, and that pushes this group that Rosa Parks was a member of to start a boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. They basically say they're not going to ride the bus system until it changes its rule and ends its segregation policies. And this boycott group, they hold meetings in private homes, people's homes in Montgomery, and they promote leaders from within their own organization. And this is where Martin Luther King kind of rises to prominence. He and his family lived in Montgomery. He was a preacher. He was a young guy. He's only like 25 years old when this boycott gets going. And the group chooses him to be their spokesman and their leader. And at first he didn't want to do it. He thought it was too much pressure. He had a young wife and kids. He didn't want to take on this level of responsibility. And he knew it was going to be dangerous. He knew he could be killed for this stuff. So he is very hesitant at first, but the organization, the civil rights group, convinces him to take this leadership position. And so the black citizens of Montgomery march up and down the streets to get newspaper coverage. And they say that they will not ride the buses until the buses are integrated with full equality. And this is called a boycott, where you just refuse to buy something. And just like the federal government refusing to give money to the individual schools, trying to force them to integrate, it's a money threat. You tell a company, I'm not going to buy anything from you until you change your policies or your actions or whatever. That often convinces a lot of companies to change, because most companies are in it for profit. They often don't really seem to care about anything else but money. So you threaten to deny them money, and you could convince them pretty quickly. The problem, though, is that this bus company is run by racists, and they don't want to give in. So this drags on and on and on, month after month, where the minority citizens of Montgomery, they refuse to take the bus, and they find other ways to get to work and to school and to stores and go visit each other and all kinds of stuff all around the city. And one thing you have to realize about Montgomery, like most American cities back then, they're heavily, and some today, they're heavily racially segregated. Where the rich white people lived in the nicer neighborhoods, often kind of in the more prosperous areas of the city, the more important areas of the city, where the high-paying jobs and whatnot were. And the black population was pushed out to the outer edges of the city. So a whole lot of these black citizens in Montgomery, they don't live close to where they work. So when they refuse to take the bus, they often have to walk to work, sometimes miles to get to work. And then after working all day in a factory or something, walk a few miles to get home. And that takes a lot of dedication to do it month after month after month. And you can see on this slide, this goes on for a calendar year from December 55 to December 56. So they walk through all kinds of weather as the weather changes throughout the year. And I mean, you guys know what it's like to, I mean, in Southern California we have a little bit different. Los Angeles, it's not that bad to walk 2 miles or something from one part of Los Angeles to another in spring or in the summer or something, because we have pretty mild weather. It doesn't get really excruciatingly hot out here, except for the desert areas. And it doesn't usually get excruciatingly cold, like down to 0 degrees or something like that. But Montgomery, Alabama is a different thing. If you've ever been in the South and you ever experienced that kind of humidity in the summertime, it's oppressive. It's unbelievable. And you walk outside and it just hits you. And I have friends that live in the Midwest and the South, and family in the Midwest, and even in the middle of the night, like when it's really hot out here, it's 100 degrees outside. At least when the sun goes down, it cools off, goes down to the 70s or so. Not in the South. It stays that hot overnight because of that humidity. And then in the wintertime, it snows. So you get temperatures 30 degrees and lower. So walking to work 2, 3, 4, 5 miles one way just to get to work, and then walking back home day after day, month after month for a full year, that's a giant just kind of physical demand. And the fact that they keep doing it shows you how dedicated they are to their movement and to ending the segregation policies of the bus. And eventually the bus companies will lose so much money because all these people are walking to work, they're not taking the bus, they're not paying for bus fare anymore. The bus company goes to the brink of bankruptcy. And that money threat is what eventually forces the bus company to give in December 56. They integrate their buses, and they end the giving up the seat policy. That's over with. And they invite the black citizens to come ride the bus again. But the black citizens have another demand. They want black bus drivers now. They don't just want white people in charge of driving the bus and making the final decisions on each individual bus. So they realize that they have the upper hand at this point. They demand a little bit more. And they get it. Within a few years, the Montgomery Bus Company will start employing black bus drivers to pursue equality even further and to get these people riding the buses again. So that's still the mid-50s. Another method of confronting segregation in public places becomes known as the sit-in. And this really starts in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, where North Carolina has long claimed for like 100 years by that point to be like the most progressive of the southern states. They have the most equality and the most opportunity for black citizens of all the southern states. But there's still segregation. And so a group of young men decide that they're going to go into basically a restaurant, and they're going to sit at the counter, and they're not going to buy anything until the restaurant ends its segregation policy. Basically, you went into this restaurant, and this will be kind of emulated all over the country. A lot of restaurants were segregated. They had a black section and a white section, or a minority section and a white section. And these guys went and sat in the white section at the white side of the counter. And they'll sit there for hours and even days, taking up a seat, saying that they have the right to be there under the Constitution with the Supreme Court decision. And they're not going to buy anything. They're just going to sit there, taking up a seat, and they say they're going to bankrupt this restaurant until the restaurant changes its policies. And it starts in Greensboro with these guys, and it gets replicated. Other groups all over the country copy it. So this picture down at the bottom in Jackson, Mississippi, another group of not just black citizens you can see in this picture, but white people join them too. I mean, there's a lot of, as they were known, liberal white people, even in the South, that believed in equality and wanted to help the black citizens achieve like real legal equality and protection. And you can see in the picture there's also a lot of racist white people who want to fight against it. So these people sit in the white section, and a lot of white racists come up and pour hot coffee on them. A lot of them come up and threaten them, say, yeah, you're sitting here now, but once you walk outside, I'm going to kill you in the alleyway. So it's a very brave thing to do, to just go in there and sit and not even say anything. Not do anything. Just being there is a brave act. And people are killed in this stuff. So that shows you the kind of depth of the hatred that these racists have for integration. And a lot of these racists will also hate the white people who join with the minorities to try to get real reliable equality. So white people would be killed in this too, the white liberals that join the minorities in trying to confront the racist systems. All right, let's see what else we have. And this idea of sitting in kind of grows into a whole other era of the civil rights movement, where a lot of people come up with all kinds of like creative ways of adopting the boycott or the sit-in, public stances against segregation to try to confront it in public and really threaten the racist systems, saying we have the right to march down the street together, and if you attack us, you're just showing how hateful and violent you are, and that's what is at the core of racism. So another group gets going that becomes known as the Freedom Riders, and these are often white college students that spend their college year or their high school year in school studying, you know, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Revolutionary War, and they get filled up with all these ideas of freedom and equality, and this is what America's about and whatnot. This is what the United States is, you know, its calling card, freedom and liberty and all those types of things. And then they look around in their own society, and they don't see freedom. They don't see people that have even the right to vote, that are terrorized into silence and submission and oppression. So a lot of groups of white northern students over the summertime, summer vacation, they get together and they get on buses and they travel into the South. And you see this group, they made their own signs, they stick them out the bus windows to get photographers to take pictures and put them in newspapers and whatnot. And they, if you read them, they basically say, we're just going in here to demonstrate for freedom. And a lot of these freedom riders, they go into the South specifically with the intention to register black people to vote and minority people to vote. So this is a public demand. Again, advertised in newspapers. This is front page news all over the country. And obviously they mostly do this in like the years 1960, 1964, the big election years, the presidential election years. And if you just read the sign, they say, I mean, the one on the right says, we just want the law to be enforced. That's all we want. Just the law that is proclaimed throughout the country. These rights that people are supposed to have, we just demand that they're able to use their rights. And in a lot of instances, when they enter these southern states, when they cross the border into Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi, oftentimes the governor and the highway patrol or the National Guard or the local sheriff is sitting there waiting for them. And they pull the buses over. And sometimes right in front of photographers, they attack these bus riders and kill some of them. They beat them to death. And they set the buses on fire, which is this picture you see below. as a message to other white northern liberals, don't you come into our place and try to give freedom and real equality to our minorities. So the idea of getting on one of these buses and riding to the South, you're taking your life in your hands, and they knew it. And it's no mystery to them. So they're extremely brave, and you just look at the picture, extremely young and ambitious. And they say they're willing to go to their death to try to end racism in the country. And this picture on the right is one of the people on the white guy on the bus who is demanding equality, and they beat him into a coma. And in his hospital bed, they took a picture of him. They put a front page newspaper of the freedom riders being attacked, and they put his arms around it and took a picture of that, and that'll end up in the newspapers also. So this is a public stance against racism, and also by the racist, a very public, obvious threat of if you come into our area and with these complaints, we're going to kill you. And the whole world is watching this. And this is not just a statewide story or a nationwide story. This is an international story. Because again, in the Cold War, the United States is proclaiming to be the protector of freedom and decency and equality throughout the world. So all this racism is an obvious hypocrisy that the Soviets use all the time to criticize the United States. Soviet leaders constantly say, yeah, these Americans, they talk about freedom, but look what's going on in their own society. They're killing each other over something as stupid as race. Which, the Soviet Union didn't have these racial problems for the most part. All right, King's Group specifically organized protests and marches throughout the South, especially in a city called Birmingham in Alabama. And Alabama and Mississippi are generally known as the most racist societies in the whole country. Racism is very prevalent, even in northern states. There's segregation, and school districts in the north, and out here in Los Angeles, in California, there's resistance to integration. So this is not just a Southern problem, the way a lot of U.S. history textbooks often present it. For example, the year that President Kennedy is shot, he's killed in November 1963. At the end of 1963, the last couple weeks of December, usually what you have at the end of the year is like these retrospectives on the year. These are the important events, and these are the people who died this year and all that kind of stuff. The LA Times published its list of the most important news stories for 1963. And to the LA Times, the most important news story was the attempt to integrate the LA Unified School District. That's a month after the President of the United States just got his head blown off. So that tells you, even in Los Angeles, which we tend to think of as a liberal, polyglot of all these different races that interact mostly peacefully, hopefully. Los Angeles at that time was that racist where they thought that school integration was a bigger news story than the president being assassinated. So this is not just a Southern problem. This is happening all over the United States, even in so-called liberal bastions like Los Angeles. But King's Group specifically organizes marches and protests and whatnot, and specifically in Birmingham, Alabama. And these are often just large groups of black citizens marching down the city streets demanding equality. And Birmingham had an especially racist county sheriff, leader of the local police, who did everything he possibly could to stop these protests, not just arresting black citizens for simply walking down the street, walking down the sidewalk, even though they, freedom to assemble is guaranteed in the First Amendment of the Constitution, but violently attacking them. So in Birmingham, the county sheriff and the fire district, the fire chief, cooperated and brought out firefighters with their firefighting hoses, their water cannons, which are so powerful that they'll unleash the water. They'll shoot the water cannon at the protesters, and the water stream is so strong it breaks the skin and can break bones. And it obviously, in the picture you see at the top, it pushes people down to the ground and pushes them down the street. So those are some non-deadly force usually used against the protesters to try to get them to stop marching, to go home. And there's instances of even more horrible use of deadly force. And this is obviously a horrific photograph of the police unleashing attack dogs on someone just walking down the street, not even doing anything, just walking in the march. And you can see the white racist police officers holding the protester, making sure he can't get away so the dogs can get him. So you take your life in your hands when you join this protest, and people join the protest, the marches, by thousands. And they knew that this was a threat, that they could be killed that day, and Martin Luther King knew it. And King was arrested several times, specifically in Birmingham, and he's booked into jail. And he wrote a famous letter from a jail cell that comes to be known as King's letter from a Birmingham jail. The letter later gets published, where he basically argues that the threat to freedom anywhere is a threat to freedom everywhere, which basically means that if you get to pick and choose, or if the government gets to pick and choose who gets to actually use their rights, if one small minority group is attacked and denied their rights, that means that the government at any time can choose to stop allowing other groups to use their rights. So it's a threat to everybody. And the statement is basically, you either have freedom or you don't. There's no gray area in that, especially the freedom to walk down the street or the freedom to vote. Because if your neighbor doesn't have the freedom to vote, then you can be attacked at any time too, even if you're not being attacked right now. So the violence against the civil rights movement is horrific. And King's movement especially, he advocated what he called nonviolent resistance, which means if the police attack you, you don't fight back. You don't defend yourself. You allow yourself to be attacked. And King thought this was important from Gandhi's example in India because he knew that newspaper reporters would be watching this and photographers would be there. And even TV news cameras would be there. And if you're just walking down the street and the camera's following you and the police attack you for no reason, I mean, that obviously makes it look like the police are attacking you for no reason. And when this stuff gets broadcast in newspapers and TV media throughout the country by the 60s, a lot of people sitting in their living rooms will watch this, just like with the internet today. When you get all these videos of police shooting people with their hands up and they're not even doing anything, they get shot. The obvious implication is that there's something wrong with the policing system. If citizens are being killed for doing nothing, then something has to change. So that's the power of photographs and imagery to convince people to, if not join the movement, at least maybe write to their congressman or make demands of their local city mayor or something like that to get involved in changing these systems to stop this madness. But King's, especially the marches in Birmingham, were mostly unsuccessful. Alabama, Mississippi, they didn't change their policies. And the attacks continue. So King decided, and other civil rights groups decide, to all get together and march on Washington, D.C. in August of that year, August 63. And march right to the Lincoln Memorial. And the statue celebrating Lincoln, who was a big driving force in ending slavery and demanding real equality. and basically demanding that Congress and the president, who at this time is still Kennedy, this is just a few months before Kennedy is murdered, demand that they do something, that they intervene, and they stop these states and these sheriffs from attacking people just using their rights. And this march is where King gives his famous "I have a dream" speech. I have a dream of equality, and that my children will grow up in a country where they aren't judged by the color of their skin, but by what he called the content of their character, how good and moralistic they are, instead of just what they look like. And President Kennedy is slowly kind of moving towards supporting the civil rights movement and trying to get legislation passed in Congress. But then Kennedy is murdered in November '63, and that makes his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, the new president, immediately when Kennedy dies. And Johnson is much more favorable toward the civil rights movement. Johnson is willing to use federal power. Johnson, he's from Texas and he's a white guy, but Johnson grew up in poverty. Johnson grew up in a house where there was no electricity and no plumbing, so he understood what it meant to be poor. And Johnson had to work really hard. He didn't go to the best universities. He went to like this second-rate college in Texas to get a college education. So he was like a kind of poor white, almost hillbilly family. And eventually runs for Congress in his local district and eventually becomes a senator and then vice president. But he always had that chip on his shoulder. He didn't like the way poor people are treated throughout the country. So he, as president and even as senator, he takes the side of poor and oppressed people. So now that he's president, he's really going to push forward on an amendment to the Constitution in '64, guaranteeing the right to vote. And he'll get it passed in '64, which basically says that states are not allowed to discriminate against voters. They're not allowed to have like taxes on people coming in to vote. You can't make them pay money to be allowed to vote. You can't give them literacy tests to vote or anything like that, which a lot of states were doing to keep the minority population from voting, because they often didn't have the money or the education to pay the tax or pass the test. So that's in the Constitution now. States, no government entity is allowed to do that stuff. And eventually we'll also pass more voting rights laws to investigate individual states, especially any state that had under 50% minority voter registration. The FBI, the Justice Department, would intervene in those states, and basically the federal government will guarantee that minorities will have the right to register and vote. And especially with this constitutional amendment, this here to the left is a map of the states that vote to ratify the amendment and vote against it. So all the states in green are the states that voted to accept this amendment to the Constitution. And these other states vote no. And you can see that most of these voting no states are in the South. And there's a few out west because in 1964, Johnson is up for re-election. It's a presidential election year. And the Republican who runs against him, Johnson's a Democrat just like Kennedy. The Republican presidential nominee is a senator from Arizona who complained about this equal rights stuff, basically saying that states have the power to set their own voting laws. So Arizona voted against it, and a couple other western states voted against it. But it passed, and it's now part of the Constitution. And Johnson ran on this in his re-election attempt in '64, and he's overwhelmingly re-elected. And in 1964, at the end of the year, in December, Martin Luther King wins the Nobel Peace Prize, which is a worldwide honor for promoting peace and equality and it's given out to many. It's given out on a yearly basis, and it's a European award, basically. I think it's from the government of Sweden or something. But even though you have a president that's very much on the side of the civil rights movement now, and King has won the Nobel Peace Prize in '64, the violence continues. King doesn't stop just because he won the award. His goal is real equality. He wants to change the society. So King continues leading marches into the spring of '65. And the most famous is the march in Selma, Alabama, where it's a statewide march, basically trying to get to the capital city of Alabama and make demands of the Alabama state government. And they have to cross this bridge over a river. You can see here on the right side. They have to cross this, it's called the Pettus Bridge, named after this guy named Pettus. And you can see just the amount of people trying to cross the bridge on this picture on the right. And they make the attempt several times, because one of the times they're met with mass violence. Basically, crossing the bridge is like crossing a county line. So they go from one county into the other on the other side of the bridge, and the new county's sheriffs, their police force, are sitting out there with weapons waiting for the marchers to arrive, and they get violently attacked and dispersed and forced to turn around and go home, end the march, which is exactly what the white racist police wanted to do. They just terrorized them into stopping these activities. And people are killed in this stuff. And this really forces Johnson to take an even closer stance in favor of the civil rights movement. So King is making this nonviolent argument, but there are other groups that don't think this nonviolent thing's working very well, because you can march down the street and maybe get killed. A lot of other black leaders and black citizens, they think this nonviolent stuff is not working. And the most famous of them is named Malcolm X from New York, Harlem, which is kind of northern New York City, basically the minority part of Harlem, the poor part, or the poorest part of New York City. So going a little bit further back, Malcolm X comes to kind of prominence in New York City in the mid-50s, so about 10 years before the march in Selma. He is a member of a group called the Nation of Islam, which is basically a Muslim movement of black citizens. And it's going in several different cities. So there's a chapter in Chicago and Detroit and all these different places, but New York is the biggest one because New York's the biggest city. So Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam. His life story is actually really interesting. He was born into a segregated society. His father is killed for taking part in civil rights demonstrations. So Malcolm X was orphaned at a very young age and sent to foster families, basically, and white families, and bounced around from those families in white schools and all kinds of things, and eventually ended up in Michigan, and later moved to New York and became a crime figure. He got involved with drug dealing and gambling, and ran his own, basically, drug dealing business, and eventually got involved in a burglary, breaking into homes and stealing stuff and selling them at the black market and making money. Because he said there's no point in getting a kind of square job in a racist society, because no black person's ever going to be allowed to rise up the ranks in a bank or a corporation or anything like that. So he says, why even try? So he turned to a crime life to make money and survive. And he's eventually, he and his group are caught burglarizing a house, and I think there were 4 people with him, There was him, another black guy, and they had 2 white women with them. And he said that they really threw the book at him in the court system in New York because he had those white women with him. That they want to make an example of him, that, you know, no black man's ever going to be allowed to live with the white woman, even in New York City, which again is supposed to be, you know, a big liberal bastion of equality and whatnot. So he got sent to jail, and as a prisoner in jail, he converted to Islam and joined this Nation of Islam by basically meeting another prisoner who kind of converted him to it, and he started reading about it and got really into it. So by the time he's released from jail, he serves his term, he serves his time, and he's released. He's a member of this organization, the Nation of Islam, in Harlem, in New York. And he continues going to their meetings and eventually becomes like one of their leaders of their organization and becomes one of their public spokesmen. And he and his group, or not his group, but the group he's a member of, they go out to the streets in Harlem and they try to gain converts, basically. And they stand on street corners and they go to coffee houses and bars and whatnot. And they tell people you should join our organization, not because we're so much of a political entity. We're not trying to, you know, end segregation or anything. But he says our group just has a better way of living. They don't drink, they don't gamble, they treat women well. They don't, you know, beat their kids, stuff like that. Just it's kind of moralistic movement. But as more people join his group, they get further involved in the civil rights kind of discussion. And Malcolm X's early statements are this non-violent thing, you know, racial integration, it doesn't work. And he starts giving interviews as this Nation of Islam population continues to grow and grow, and they start making moves to protect their own citizens from police brutality, and guarding them. If the police attack one of their people and, you know, put them in a hospital bed, the Nation of Islam trains its young men to learn karate and use guns, and they'll go to the hospital and they'll stand in the hallway to guard that person who's, you know, been hospitalized, so that the police don't come by and murder them. So this gains a lot of respect in the black community, obviously. So Malcolm X becomes a kind of famous person in New York City. He starts doing TV interviews and newspaper interviews and whatnot, and interviewers ask him, you know, what are you about? What do you believe in? And why do you have people joining your movement in such large numbers? And Malcolm X says that, you know, he believes in the power of understanding black history, from being kidnapped and enslaved in Africa and brought to what eventually becomes the United States. And he said, you know, we shouldn't try to ignore that history. We should embrace it and embrace black identity, and not try to, you know, dress and be like white people. And his big example was black people should not try to straighten their hair and lighten their hair to make it look like a white person's hair, which you would have to like basically bleach and put lye, which burns your skin, puts that in your hair for as long as you can stand it to make your hair like as light as possible, like a light brown or a red or something like that. And he said that's stupid. You're gonna burn your natural body in order to try to look like a white person. And he said that's evidence of how much black people hate their own identity. So he says you should love yourself for what you are and not try to be someone else. And he also said that black people should, and minorities, they should go buy stuff from black-owned businesses. Stop buying stuff from white-owned businesses. Don't put your money in a white-owned bank, because they're part of the segregation system. They're part of the racist system. So take your money out of those banks and put them in local black-owned banks, so that the black community can build up its wealth, its economic power. Then maybe in the future they'll be able to do something about the entire racist system. And he says you're never going to be able to accomplish that if your community is poor. And he points at, say, groups like Martin Luther King's group that are pursuing nonviolent resistance, and they're getting killed in the streets. And Malcolm X says, nonviolence doesn't work. And he says this in a famous interview that I'll show you a clip of in a few minutes. He says, basically, if I'm marching down the street and police come to attack me, I have the right to defend myself. And he says, I'll kill a policeman. who comes up and tries to attack me just for walking down the street, using the rights that I'm supposed to have. So he talks about self-defense. And he openly advertises the fact that the Nation of Islam trains its members in how to use guns and weapons, and tries to convince them to buy those weapons and keep them in their homes for self-defense. And he advocates especially black men learning like karate and martial arts and whatnot so they can defend themselves even if they don't have a weapon. So they'll be more powerful one-on-one than any police officer they encounter. And he also says that integration is a failure. Supreme Court gave its decision years ago. The white racists, they don't want to integrate. They're doing everything they can to stop it. So Malcolm X said the real solution is separation. Don't integrate, don't bring people together, just fully isolate them from each other. Basically saying that white people and minority people cannot live together. The history of hatred and violence is too long and too deep. They will never be peaceful from each other. So he says they should live in different cities, and maybe even different countries from each other. And I have a clip to show you that will kind of demonstrate that. In one interview he gave, I think it's in New York, where it's basically a debate between Malcolm X and kind of Martin Luther King advocate. And there's a white interviewer kind of sitting in the middle that's like the moderator asking the questions. So just in this answering a couple questions in just a couple minutes, Malcolm X will give you basically point by point all these different kinds of ideas that he's becoming famous for. So we'll go to that real quick. Okay, so I mean, you get it pretty clearly from that interview. If the police attack me, I have the right to defend myself and attack back, and even kill them if it comes to it, and even compares racists to dogs. So it's a pretty clear statement of what he's about. So Malcolm is increasingly popular. More huge amounts of people. This Nation of Islam starts off very, very small when he gets involved with it. And by the early 60s, it's becoming a kind of nationwide phenomenon. Many minority people are joining the Nation of Islam, specifically because his leadership and his example. And it's a powerful example. He has a kind of message that a lot of minorities hadn't really considered before, at least not this publicly. So Malcolm X, he's a kind of celebrity. He's like an intellectual celebrity. And people ask him about all kinds of current events and whatnot for years. And by the time President Kennedy is assassinated in November '63, the reporters come around to Malcolm X. And the days after the assassination, they ask him, well, what do you think about Kennedy being killed? And publicly in front of news cameras, he says, it's not surprising to me. He said, this is an example of the racist hatred that white people have always used against minorities. That hatred has just come back and has killed a famous white guy. And he says, it makes no difference to me, really. And he said, this is, quote, the chickens coming home to roost. That all this violence that the white community is involved with, these white racists, now they're turning it on other white people that are choosing to join the civil rights movement or any kind of equality-based movements. And Malcolm basically said he didn't really care, and it's not too surprising to him. And that was a shocking thing for someone to say in this period of mourning. Kennedy was seen as like a young, ambitious, and in a lot of ways innocent. This is before we know about all the extramarital affairs and whatnot, and all the drugs that he was on for pain medication. So Kennedy is seen as like a symbol of the young, ambitious America that wants to save the world. And after he gets shot, that's why Kennedy's assassination was such an emotional event. And a lot of people who disagreed with Kennedy politically still cried over his death. And for Malcolm to say this kind of stuff, like, who really cares, is very shocking to a lot of people. So there's a lot of outrage against Malcolm X in the days after Kennedy's assassination, to the point that the leaders of the Nation of Islam tell Malcolm, you have to shut up for a while, because what you said is really embarrassing to our organization. So the leaders of the Nation of Islam, the high-level leaders, basically censor Malcolm. They order him to go into what they call media silence. He's not allowed to lead marches or give interviews or anything like that for a year, until November '64, so a full calendar year. And Malcolm decides to use that time. Can't really participate in the organization or do anything like that anymore. And he decides to go to the Middle East, to Mecca, which is the home foundation, is the home city of Islam. So he goes there. He wants to learn more about Islam and participate in what is basically a pilgrimage that all Muslims are supposed to take at some point in their life. They go to Mecca and they walk around the Kaaba, the big building in Mecca, a big religious shrine, basically. So he decides to do that since he's under kind of curfew, basically media curfew, for a year. He wants to use his time somewhat productively. So he goes to Mecca, and when he goes to the Kaaba, you're supposed to walk around it 3 times, which takes a little while. It's a big building. And he sees people from all over the world coming together in Mecca. And this is a pilgrimage site, so Muslims from all over the planet come to Mecca, and still do today. And they interact peacefully. And for the first time in his life, he interacts in a society that doesn't have that hardcore racism. And he sees people of all races interacting not just peacefully, but enjoyably. And that completely changes his perspective on what is possible. So he comes back to the United States a very changed person. In late '64, he comes back and gives a news conference at the airport that he lands back in. I think it's in New York City. And he says he's no longer going to be involved in the Nation of Islam, because he says they're also racist. They believe in the separation of the races, and he says, this experience I just had shows me that people of all races can come together peacefully and cooperating in what he calls solving shared problems with shared solutions, working together, basically. So he completely leaves the former organization, and he criticizes it. He says he's going to start his own organization that he calls the Organization for Afro-American Unity, which he calls an international movement for peace and integration, not just in the United States. He wants to get all races in the United States together to pursue equality and freedom, but he wants to connect that movement in the U.S. to movements in Africa to end segregation in Africa and in Europe and in Latin America. So he's thinking much, much larger than just the United States. He's thinking on a global scale. So this experience in Mecca completely changed his ideology. He still believes in self-defense, and loving yourself for who you are, not trying to be someone else. But he abandons this idea of separation of the races. He wants the races to come together. So he's a big integrationist now, by late '64, and publicly. And at that point, he has a meeting with Martin Luther King, who he had heavily criticized for many years, and publicly meets with Martin Luther King to basically bury the hatchet and talk about how they can pursue the civil rights movement through their 2 different organizations and how they can cooperate. And Malcolm is assassinated himself just a couple months later in February '65. Most people believe through the cooperation of his former organization, this Nation of Islam, who he's now heavily criticizing, telling all of his former followers, leave that group and come with me into this new organization. And a lot of people believe that the assassins had direct contact with the U.S. government. That racist within the FBI or the CIA or something basically got permission to kill him. So he's shot in Harlem in February of '65. And this is another one of these big assassinations that hits a kind of liberal, change-oriented type of leader. And just a month after that, King leads the march in Selma in March '65. So all this stuff is interacting. It's happening at really the same time, along the same timeline, same chronology. I just separate kind of Malcolm out for a little while to talk about his different perspective on self-defense rather than nonviolence. Another group that was into self-defense became known as the Black Panther movement, and they start in Oakland in California, so way out here on the West Coast. They get going in '66, a year after Malcolm's assassination and a year after the march in Selma. They basically start as like a community protection group, because a lot of black citizens in Oakland get attacked by the white Oakland police force. They get basically oppressed and brutalized. They get there's many accusations that white police officers in Oakland rob black citizens. They rob them at gunpoint and harass them and follow them around, do all kinds of things. So the Black Panthers gets going as this group of young black men in Oakland who basically get together and they get a car and they get a few guns and they drive around Oakland following police cars, intimidating the police, letting the police know that we're watching you. We're not going to let you get away with attacking citizens, black citizens anymore. So the Black Panthers, they get going at first as a kind of neighborhood watch almost against their own police, against the racist in the police department. And the Black Panthers eventually become a political party and take up political stances, especially protesting gun control laws, because they say that these gun control laws are specifically designed to stop black people from getting weapons, to keep them defenseless. And this picture is the original founders of the Black Panthers, and a couple of them are killed in these activities. So some of their leaders don't make it very far; they die. And there's accusations of police repression, basically. And the Black Panther Party becomes a pretty radical political party by the late '60s, and they start running their own presidential candidates and governor candidates and whatnot, and stays around. And is still around in some places even today. And still, it's a constant place that a lot of white people point at as like, this is what happens when you allow black people to gain some kind of power, and they start getting real aggressive and they start attacking white people and all kinds of things. So even today there's a lot of racism and paranoia of the Black Panther Party, like they're going to try to overthrow the white suburbs or something like that. But there's a lot of violence in U.S. cities, especially starting in '64, when a lot of communities seem to believe that this nonviolent approach just doesn't work, and so there are riots in Harlem and Brooklyn, and also another kind of offshoot of New York City, part of New York City, in 1964. There's a giant riot in the black neighborhood of Los Angeles called Watts in '65. What is today basically referred to as South Central Los Angeles. So a lot of communities have grown very impatient with the nonviolent sit-ins and whatnot, and they try other tactics. And a lot of that violence just inspires a lot of white racists to say, look what happens when you start giving into some of their demands, and they just want more and more, and they're not really trustworthy, and they're just violent at heart and all that kind of stuff. But it's usually just racist fears.